next discussion is a very special session on Ukraine. More than a year has passed since Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. This session will reflect on the lessons that have come from the conflict. Can you please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr Yuriy Sak, advisor to the Ukrainian Minister for Defence, who will be providing some opening remarks. Following Dr Yuriy, we'll also welcome our moderator and panellists for the session, Beck Shrimpton, the Director of the Sydney Dialogue at ASPI, Baiba, NATO Assistant Secretary-General for Public Diplomacy, His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko, the Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia, Luckey, the founder of Anduril Industries, and former Australian Army Major General Mick Ryan. Welcome, Dr Yuriy Sak.
So more than 13 months. I've been now in Australia traveling from one city to another with my colleagues from the Ministry of Defence of Ukraine for a bit more than 2 weeks. And as we see the cities of Australia, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, we tell each other, do you know what it reminds us of? It reminds us of Ukraine 13 months ago. It reminds us of our country, which is creative, gifted, talented, peaceful. And 13 months ago, we lost all that. We've just come back from a meeting which was taking place at the Sydney Cricket Ground, a beautiful place. But as soon as we walked in, I realized that the first news that I read today in the morning as I woke up was the news of Maxim Galichin, a 22-year-old gold medal winning boxer from Ukraine who was killed on March 10th and who was awarded yesterday the Star of Hero by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. You will hear from Ukraine's ambassador, Vasyl Myroshnychenko, in a moment, and I and him, we come from the same alma mater, from the Kyiv Institute of International Relations. During the first 2 weeks of the war, 2 of Vasyl's classmates were killed. And this is what is happening on a daily basis. Another colleague of mine who is sitting right in front of me here, before the war, he was one of the co-founders of a very sophisticated DNA startup. 2 other co-founders were brilliant scientists. Between ourselves, we used to say that one of these guys, his name is Bijon Sharipov, that when there will be a day when he will make a discovery for humankind in the realm of DNA. And then 3 months ago, his body was found in the trenches in the Eastern Front of Ukraine, and it was identified by DNA sampling. Now that's not normal. That is not normal. Every Uber driver who I've met here in this country and in this city, when we say goodbye to each other, they wish us kick the Russians, beat the Russians. Everybody we meet everywhere in every country want Ukraine to prevail and win. And look, today one of the most frequent questions that I get as somebody who's responsible for strategic communications within the Ministry of Defence of Ukraine is, when is the counteroffensive going to begin? Think about it. We are talking about Ukraine's counteroffensive. 13 months ago, even our close allies were doubtful if we would withstand 3 to 7 days of this onslaught, of this aggressive invasion. We're still standing, we're still fighting. Now, one of the most important things to understand, and which is something that sets apart this tragic genocidal war from the ones that we have witnessed in the recent couple of decades, is that we are not asking our allies to fight for us. We are not asking to send in the troops. We're just saying, give us the tools. When the war began, we had ammunition supplies and weapons for a very, very short time, and we had to act fast. After that, a Rammstein format was initiated by the US, and now over 50 countries participate in these regular monthly meetings, and the supply of military assistance is continuous, and we are now talking about a counter-offensive, which means that we are determined, ready, and capable of achieving victory with the help of our allies. I want to use this opportunity being here to thank the Australian people and the Australian government for standing with Ukraine since day one of this large-scale invasion. The Australian Bushmasters have become a household name in Ukraine. You ask anyone in Ukraine, you know, what they associate Australia with, they will tell you it's Bushmasters. You know, not kangaroos, not koalas. I mean, look, when I was a kid, visiting Australia was one of my dreams. And I wanted to come to Australia to see kangaroos and koalas. But tomorrow I'll be going to Bendigo, and now I want to see Bushmasters and the Hawkeyes. And trust me, I wish I was on a different mission in this beautiful, friendly country that has been supportive of Ukraine so strongly. And this is why one of the things that we keep telling our friends, everybody we meet here, is Australia, during the first period of the war, was the largest contributor to Ukraine's support outside of NATO. It's a very proud title, which I'm sure every Australian aspires to keep and maintain. And Australia, we invite Australia to join the International Tank Coalition, because tanks for Ukraine are tanks for freedom. We are not fighting for some random small cities of Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Avdiivka, Marinka, the cities that have been obliterated, decimated, pulverized. They are uninhabitable. They're not cities that we will be able to reconstruct. They will have to be built from scratch. But this is not about just our territory or our people. This is about the global freedom. This is why whenever our president addresses the international audience, our Minister of Defense, we say that, look, de facto, we are already a member of NATO alliance because we are protecting the eastern flank of NATO with what we have. And we are doing everything we can to transform our army using NATO standards, using NATO modern weaponry. And the technological advances that we have seen during the last 13 months, which is the main theme of this conference and this session in particular, have been very impressive. I'm sure you have seen how Ukrainians invent new types of weapons. They shoot down Iranian drones with with what we can, and it shouldn't be that way. That's why we're inviting our allies to, I hope it doesn't sound cynical, but right now Ukraine is a very unique testing ground, which will allow us to improve the weapon system that we receive, to share that knowledge with our allies, and make sure that Ukraine and all other countries are better protected from, for example, from the Iranian drones in the future. Because Iranian drones have not been created for Ukraine by Iran. You all know who they were created for originally, right? So it only makes sense, and it is logical, that we should all be interested in finding ways to how to jam them, to how to improve the electronic warfare equipment that will allow us all to be protected from this type of weaponry. Now, Ukrainian government is taking the technological aspect of this war, and this is a very weird war, by the way, and I'm sure you know this. On the one hand, you see images and video footage of Russians taking off tanks from the monuments, right? Like 70 years ago, they've been put there, T-34s, for example. On the other hand, it's a war of drones. So as a government, we are investing heavily for example, into the drone industry. Right now, our Ministry of Defense is already partnering with over 60 productions and manufacturers of drones in Ukraine. I mean, quite honestly, I don't think there's any one self-respecting businessman in Ukraine who doesn't have a drone manufacturing facility right now. When the time comes, of course, we will be happy to share the knowledge that we gain on the battlefield with our allies, with our friends. Within the Ministry of Defense, very recently, a new position and a new department was set up that will deal specifically with technological advances. It will be about digital transformation of the Ukrainian armed forces, about digital development, about integrating Ukraine into the NATO logistical procurement systems, about making sure that every invention and every investment in every Miltech startup in Ukraine results in saving lives of our soldiers, results in increasing our capacity and our defense capability. Just so that you understand, for example, thanks to the use of the so-called Delta system, I won't go into detail because I don't have time. I don't have time at all by now, but we are able to, for example, instead of shooting 10 artillery shells, we can just achieve our goals by 1. And that's because the data that is collected, assembled by the new software. So thank you very much. Stand with Ukraine. This is a war that we will definitely win. We are confident it can be achieved this year in 2023. We have seen it's possible. You have seen it's possible. Let's just do it.
Well, thank you, Yuriy, very much for that powerful opening set of remarks. Look, it's really important that we do hear about this from those who are from Ukraine and fighting this war in Ukraine. Look, Yuriy couldn't be any closer to this conflict, and I really do thank you for both your personal insights and your reflections. It's clear that as we move further into the second year of this large-scale conflict in Ukraine, that the conversation globally has got to move to how this war ends. To understand how any theory of victory can play out, it's really important to reflect on what's happened so far, what we know about the key protagonists, and what might ultimately bring about the cessation of hostilities. There are many ways to tackle this conversation, but one of the most interesting and enduring features of this conflict, as well as the previous 2 days of discussion, I think, has been the role of technology and the private sector. And in this case, the way the Ukrainian government has mobilised a supply of both military and dual-use technology to help defend itself against a brutal and illegal attack. So I acknowledge the extraordinary will and the adaptability of the Ukrainian people to push back against Russian aggression, the ability of the government of the Ukraine to speak to assure, to support and to organise its own people. This has been remarkable. Technology, much of it from the commercial sector, has played a key role in supporting the Ukraine government in its fight, but so too has military technology. And as the war moves into its next phase, both of these have a key role to play. Partnerships and alliances, especially NATO, even while Ukraine is not formally a member of that alliance, have demonstrated an agility and ability to respond. And it has been many of the newer, the smaller European players that have really led from the front. And we're lucky enough to hear from one of them shortly. We will take a break after some initial comments to hear from Prime Minister Kaja Kallas of Estonia. And I will talk a little bit more to that before we hear from her. We've got an amazing panel of experts here to talk to you about this, highly relevant. We've got international partners and experts. We have NATO, we have Ukraine, we have the CEO of a private defence company that has been right at the forefront of this fight and really represents the kind of technologies that we need to be thinking about into the future. And we have an expert strategist and proudly Australian former Major General Mick. And look, Mick, I'm going to start with you because you've just been to Ukraine. And I'd really love you to reflect on what you saw there. But you've also been a commentator on technology and warfare and the concept of human-machine teaming and how technology and human capability work together. So can I just start with you and some reflections on your time in Ukraine and some thoughts about technology and humanity?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Beck. It's great to be here. Thanks. And I feel quite humbled to be on this stage with the people I'm up here with. A couple of things I'd just note. Firstly, you said in your opening remarks it's time to talk about how this war ends. I would say it's a variation. It's time to talk about how we can speed up Ukraine winning.
Yes.
I mean, that is how this war ends,
Yep.
right? So how do we speed up Ukraine winning? It's not just a military imperative or a political imperative, it's a humanitarian imperative. The quicker we beat Russia, the less Ukrainian people die in this war. So I guess there's a couple of observations I'd make from what I've seen. Clearly, Ukraine is getting ready for this significant series of offensives. It won't just be one great push, I don't think. It'll be a series of activities. And it'll be really important not just to demonstrate to the Ukrainian people that the sacrifices of the last 13 months have been worth it, but also to demonstrate to the West that Ukraine is an effective user of the assistance that's been provided so far, but still needs more to see this through to its logical conclusion, which is the defeat of Russia and re-securing all of its territory, including Crimea, before this war ends. So, there's a profound, I think, understanding of senior people that I spoke to just how important this coming offensive is. There's also, too, a great understanding of the growing asymmetry in technology that you talked about between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I mean, the Russians actually started this war with better technology and more of it. They're going to end it almost fighting in the Stone Age, and the Ukrainians are fighting in the 22nd century almost. I think the Ukrainians have been better at husbanding technology, husbanding equipment, and the Russians have just thrown it in willy-nilly in a way that's not strategic. It's not anything really, it's just throwing mass at a problem, and it hasn't helped them very much. Finally, on technology, my observation would be through this war that there's a very entrepreneurial spirit in the Ukrainian armed forces. I think it was there. I mean, I've studied the Ukrainian in the wake of the 2014 war before this. But I think too, with the mobilisation of young Ukrainians, and not so young Ukrainians over the last year, they have brought into the military this commercial sector understanding, the academic sector understanding, and they've used it to innovate, to try new things, whether it's, supporting artillery systems, the gap between detection and destruction has closed more, whether it's digital battlefield systems to connect people better, which just isn't discretionary anymore, it's mandatory on the battlefield. But I think that marriage of professional soldiers with newly mobilised people from different sectors is a war-winning one. Yeah. You're not seeing that from the Russians, you're seeing it from the Ukrainians, and they're utilising that well. Fabulous,
thank you so much. Vasyl, I'd like to come to you now. You were obviously part of the system, and you come from a technological and a strategic communications background. What strategies do you think were already in place that gave you the advantages that you were able to then, turn to your both operational and strategic advantage as the invasion happened? And if you could please, what are your key insights into the role of strategic communications, both before and during conflict?
Look, it played a major role, and I would like to highlight our president's leadership, because I think it was instrumental. And I think the fact that he understands the power of communication, he's out there with people every day recording a message for the domestic audience, and he's always out there talking to international audiences. I think his ability to communicate directly, this is what gave us an advantage, this is what gave us strengths, this is what gave confidence to our partners that we will keep on fighting. Remember that video that he recorded at his office outside saying, I'm here, my prime minister is here, my team is here, so give me ammo, I don't need a ride. And I think it's already been now coined as one of his greatest quotes that he's made. But it did play a role because at times of war, leadership matters. And I think seeing leadership coming from the president, you see how it's gone down to different other levels. And you see that leadership coming from different ministers. I see that leadership coming from many other Ukrainian ambassadors who are abroad, because at the end of the day, it's all about, can you get the message across? Can you talk to every Australian, who, by the way, I meet here on a daily basis in large numbers from different walks of life. And every one of them tells me, we are so happy Australia is supporting Ukraine. And every one of them believes Australia can do more and should do more to support Ukraine. And I think that ability to communicate directly to the Australian people gives me confidence that Australian government will carry on supporting Ukraine. But we've seen also on the technological side this phenomenal cooperation out there. Ukraine was lucky to have a very vibrant software development industry. By the way, when I came here, I learned that many Australian companies have offices in Ukraine or have outsourced teams working in Ukraine in R&D, in software development. Our talent is huge. And I think that was a response of the private sector, of business, to support the government and to support the country. And therefore, what Yuri has referred to, before the war, we had 10 companies producing drones. Now we have 60 companies producing drones. We see phenomenal breakthrough in the electronic warfare, in the targeting systems, in other platforms. Because look, we just don't have time. We have to learn quickly, we have to adapt, we have to be vibrant and agile, and just react to the circumstances. And look, there is no better motivation than Russia, which wants to kill you and to destroy you, and you need to defend yourself. Hence, hence our resilience, hence our ability to be out there. But coming back to your question on strategic communications, it's crucial. And we've been discussing here on a previous panel, disinformation, propaganda. How do we deal with that? And the answer is simple. It's trust. It's all about the trust. If you can trust the sources of communication, if you can trust official communication coming from the country at war, which is Ukraine, this is how you can get a message across. Of course, we see many challenges of how Russia has been twisting the narrative, how Russia has been weaponizing history, how Russia has been weaponizing religion, church, grievances from the past, which they know how to actually use for their advantage, especially when they deal in Africa, when they deal in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia as well. And this is where I've been in talks with the Australian government to step up their capabilities in fighting disinformation, especially here in the region, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the Pacific. I think it's very important that the message is correct and that bigger powers cannot wage their malign foreign influence on those countries, cannot bribe them, cannot use their influence, cannot coerce them into something they don't want to do. But they're cursed by bigger powers. And I think it's a big lesson here for the region, for who the sovereignty and integrity of their borders is essential and crucial. Especially sometimes you're just too small and you're squeezed in between different big countries. But at the end of the day, the matter of sovereignty is very important.
Absolutely, thank you. Baiba, from NATO, you have a strategic communications background yourself, and obviously responsibilities there. Look, can I ask you to talk about how allies and partners around the world are going to be able to support Ukraine to win on its terms? And how has NATO responded to the lessons of the deployment of technology in this conflict? And I'm talking about things like social media platforms and the way they have been used, but I'm also thinking of the drone and the counter-drone kind of dynamics that we've seen as well.
Thank you very much, and great to be on this panel. This is exactly what we need. We have the expertise from outside the government. We have the private sector doing what it can. We have great Ukrainian ambassador here. We have Ukrainian military, and we have you from Indo-Pacific to tell the stories and to bring us together. For NATO, very clearly, the big adaptation started after 2014. What we are doing currently is actually a catalyzed process of adaptation, because the war on Europe's territory, the kinetic war, but also the hybrid war started then was invasion in 2014 into Ukraine, both illegal annexation of Crimea, but also the war in the east of Ukraine. So for NATO, that meant that the whole military strategy had to be changed. So military very much led that process. And that meant going from out-of-area operations into collective defense and changing literally everything. Defense planning, force structures that is currently being discussed, the allocation of forces. So to create that defensive capability and based on unity, which is the center of gravity for NATO, where our center and main core task, collective defense, can be implemented from the first minute, from the first second, for every inch of the Allied territory. So very clearly that has been a major effort that started in 2014, and that is advancing now. And indeed, the unity that we saw from the Allies and the outrage at Russia's actions, despite engaging diplomatically with Russia, we held NATO-Russia Council in January last year, being very open and engaging and actually seeing whether there is a substantial concern that can be sort of addressed or in mutual dialogue solved, because prevention of war, deterrence of Russia from war was still the ultimate task for everyone, and everybody was committed around that. And we saw that it was all on Russian side, just another sort of fake move, whatever, you know, that nothing changed really on the ground. So from there on, and again, having that very clear understanding on the ground, how Russia was moving its forces, what capabilities it was moving, it was very clear that, yes, the invasion will be happening, and we even were able to identify the date. So that triggered the next stage of adaptation, which was very much the understanding that the concern for NATO is not just NATO itself, but it's actually the unity around supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes and whatever is needed. And again, that is based on the fact that NATO owns self-defense. We are a self-defense organization based on the UN Charter, the same self-defense that Ukraine is basing its self-defense. Article 51 of the UN Charter. And that's why for countries in Indo-Pacific, it matters as much as it matters for those in Europe. If we believe that the rules-based international order, embodiment of which is a UN Charter, where the war is recognized not anymore as normal means of managing differences among countries, but it recognizes territorial integrity, it recognizes the inviolability of borders, if these, and unacceptance of the aggression. If these principles actually matter, we all need to support Ukraine. So that's why that global unity, unity from the private sector, unity from everything, because at the end, also private sector needs rules, trade needs rules, education, everything that we talk about, there have to be some type of organizational principle. So that is where NATO was very clearly in lead on having both that military adaptation, uniting allies, partners around providing whatever aid, whatever is necessary for Ukraine, but then organizing military aid outside NATO, because that was much more efficient, faster, you know, less sort of bureaucratic, and so on and so forth. So this is where we are at NATO, and as Vasyl said, the leadership of President Zelensky has been exemplary. It also showed the light. It showed not only to Ukrainians, but the whole world, that this is a country, this is a leadership that will fight for its country. It's not going to run away. It's not going to disappear. It's embodiment of that fight and self-defense and the rules-based international order, and that is what Ukraine is fighting for. So at the end, we have all vested interests for Ukraine to be successful, have the will, have the ability, and the means to win.
Thank you, Baiba. Now, Palmer, you had actually had a conversation with President Zelensky about some capabilities that in hindsight, and hindsight is a beautiful thing, may have been really useful to have been in place a little earlier. Your company, Anduril Industries, is it's a disruptive company. It does things really differently. Tell us about what you're doing, why, and how Anduril Industries is involved in Ukraine and what you're doing to support the Ukrainian people.
Well, Anduril is a defense products company more than a defense contractor, which means we use our own money to decide what to build, how to build it, and when it's done. And then we work with governments to get these things out into the field. Whether it's here in Australia or elsewhere, we don't go in with a white paper and say, hey, we have this idea, give us money to do this. We're putting our own money into things that we believe in as well. And I think that's really important. It's something that the defense industry in the West used to do, that it does not do nearly enough anymore. What you're talking about is a conversation I had with Zelensky long before the war started. We were doing work with US Border Patrol, doing border security, and we had a conversation about how we could deploy some of our technology to the eastern border of Ukraine to help track some of the Russian incursions that were already occurring, and then potentially help deter an invasion by making it clear that targeting information could be provided immediately from what's come across the border. The problem we ran into is that the US State Department and the US government position at the time was that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine, that it was just saber rattling, and that anything that we provided to Ukraine would in fact antagonize Russia, and that was not something that wanted to be done. And I wish I could say that I fought tooth and nail against that, or that I really deeply understood the issue. One of the big mistakes that I've made in my career was going along with that and saying, you know what, okay, I'm going to trust the US assessment of this, and and I can't actually sell to Ukraine even if I wanted to without permission from the US government. So it's a little bit of a hollow thing for me to pretend there's anything I could have done. Obviously, we've now realized that it was not off the table, that Russia was planning on launching a full-scale invasion. Zelensky was absolutely right about that, and at a time when so many people were saying that economic intertanglement was going to preclude any major conflict, that Russia was going to be sane from an economic actor perspective, it turns out that there are bad actors in the world who are willing to act on things beyond their immediate economic self-interest. And you can call it maybe they believe in what they think is destiny. Maybe they believe that in the long run they're going to make more money that way. Maybe it's even just politics or their own ego. But for whatever reason, we need to realize that we live in a world where these types of conflicts will happen. And not to toot my own horn, but that's why I got into the defense industry. I sold my last company for billions of dollars. I could be doing anything. I could be having a lot more fun building video games and virtual reality systems. And people tell me I must be having way more fun working on weapons than virtual reality and games. They're totally wrong. It's actually very depressing, and it requires you to be very cynical, and it burns up your spirit, and it turns you into a worse person. But it's really important. Working on video games is fun. Working on the tools that are used to enact violence on others, that's not a thing that most people, I think, naturally wake up wanting to do. It's corrosive on the human spirit. But it's important that we have people who work on it nonetheless, because it's very critical. And what a failure as a coalition of nations we are if we put our best and brightest to work on better search engine technology and better advertising technology, and don't put them to work on the things that preserve the order internationally that brought those things into being in the first place. And that's why I got into the defense industry. The one thing that I think we've seen come out of Russia's invasion that is positive is that people, I think, have woken up and realized they have to support Ukraine. They have to support other nations that are in similar positions. And we need to make sure that things like this don't happen again, can't happen again, because the bad actors are too afraid of what will happen next.
Mick, just before we move on, I want to give you a quick chance to respond to that. You've spent a lot of time thinking about innovation and that rapid ability to get capability to the warfighter. Can you just offer a bit of a response to what Palmer's said and what you think we need to do and how we need to think a bit differently?
Well, firstly, I agree with everything he said, actually. I mean, yeah, he's right. Building weapons and these kind of things are corrosive to the soul, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And we should be having our best and brightest thinking about national security, not just building weapons, but building a system that's enduring and ensures for the future prosperity of our people, right? So I totally endorse what Palmer just said. I do think, I've studied military organisations for a long time. We're very conservative, but for good reason. Some of that conservatism makes perfect sense. We don't want to reinvent ourselves every time we go to war. If we know what works, we want to keep training people in it. But that can lead to bad behaviour, can lead to bad incentives that lead to suboptimal performance or losing wars. And getting that balance right is a really important function of leadership. And part of leadership is actually going out on a limb and taking some risk. And I think we need to ensure that we have the incentives for both government leaders and military leaders to take those risks. And I'm not sure those incentives have always existed in this country.
Perfect. Look, thank you. And a great way to segue to the next part of this session. I'd like to move now to hear from Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. So for any of those citizens or leaders of smaller countries within regions that have traditionally been dominated or led by larger ones, Prime Minister Kallas has a lesson for all of us. And if there is anyone globally who has matched President Zelensky's skill, his courage and his honesty, it is her. So as we listen to her now, I want us all to think about the power of speaking truth and of the importance of speaking truth to power. To our Pacific Island family, to the smaller Southeast Asian neighbours around us, Prime Minister Kallas and the leadership shown by her and Estonia is something of a shining beacon. Now, she's just won a really important election. This is a ringing endorsement from her own people of her personal courage and her stance on an issue that is enormously important globally. So I'm really honoured that we can bring that example to the Indo-Pacific today and to this forum. Over to Prime Minister Kaja Kallas.
Thank you to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for inviting me to this year's Sydney Dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to chair the first ever official UN Security Council meeting on cybersecurity. Almost everyone there stressed that all states have already agreed that international law, including the UN Charter in its entirety, applies in cyberspace. Only 2 countries did not. Half a year later, one of those countries, Russia, started its full-scale aggression against Ukraine and violated every rule in the book. For years, we heard predictions that the next big war would be a kind of cyber Armageddon, but instead, Russia brought back large-scale conventional war. A year ago, the world woke up to the images from Bucha, a suburb of Kiev, where Russian occupiers had brutally tortured and killed civilians before it was liberated by the Ukrainian forces. The extent of Russia's war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide today repeat the Kremlin's atrocities from the past. The fact that Putin is wanted by the International Criminal Court speaks for itself and shows that no one is immune from responsibility, not even heads of state. During Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, much of our focus has been on conventional war. Our vocabulary is javelins, stingers, leopards, and HIMARS, rightly so. The aggressor must be defeated on the battlefield. Ukraine must win, and for this, they need all the military support it can get, and fast. But as I often stress, in addition to conventional war, Russia is also waging a hybrid war. This includes energy war, information war, cyber war. We must draw lessons from this, both for our own support to Ukraine and to take the leap forward in our own defense. Russian aggression is also a reminder that we actively need to enforce a world where rules still apply and where technology works for, not against, democratic societies and human rights. First, cyber integrated into regular warfare is now established practice. An hour before Russian tanks rolled over Ukraine's border, Russia took down Viasat satellites. It left the Ukrainian military without the vital communication line for the first few days. There was also a big spillover effect. For example, across Europe, it took offline hundreds of thousands of Viasat TV subscribers. In Germany, it took offline more than 11 gigahertz of wind turbine generation capacity. This is just one example of direct collateral damage from Russian aggression in the rest of Europe. Russia has also targeted digital infrastructure, data centers, wireless masts, in the same way they have targeted energy infrastructure. And second, having a trustworthy digital society is a strength, not a weakness. Ukraine's digital backbone has been invaluable to keep the state running and deliver services online, even during the war. Many Russian cyber attacks have not been successful, not because of luck, but because of Ukraine has spent years building up cyber resilience with the help from Estonia and others. And now they have lessons to teach us. Some government data systems were physically relocated, similarly Estonia's pioneering data embassy concept. The Ukrainian state app called Dia was offering citizens a one-stop shop for public services already before the full-scale war. Now it allows Ukraine to keep providing services for millions of refugees spread across Europe or trapped under Russian occupation. It has even replaced physical identity documents. Estonia is already working with Ukrainian partners to adopt the app also for our citizens. Ukraine has also shown us how the skillful use of technology helps to keep society going even during the war. Taxes paid, public services available, data kept safe and secure. Third, there's currently a real sense of impunity in cyberspace. The blurred lines of responsibility and difficult attribution make cyber attacks more attractive as a tool. Russia continues to use the so-called DDoS diplomacy to send political signals and try to create disruptions beyond Ukraine. We are seeing more activities by state-sponsored malicious cyber groups across the world. Nearly every week, Estonia experiences major cyber attacks against government and private services. Some of those have been more severe than the 2007 cyber attacks against Estonia. The effects have been minimal, but only because we are well prepared. And finally, the private sector has transformed its role during this war. Companies like Palo Alto, Amazon Web Services, and others have provided much-needed services and security measures for Ukrainians to defend their e-governance. The analysis provided by companies like Microsoft and Mandiant has been crucial. We need to take public-private partnership to a whole new level, but we also need to manage our mutual expectations. For example, when it comes to the spread of disinformation, social media platforms are still not doing enough. To paraphrase Churchill, due to social media, a lie gets half around the universe before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. This is a particular concern in smaller markets like Estonia. Ladies and gentlemen, the question now is, where do we go from here? First, we must all be prepared that the cyber war will continue even after the conventional war ends. The security environment has changed and we must all adapt rapidly. A strategy of deterrence against cyber attacks or disinformation has not been sufficient. Our focus must be increasingly on resilience, giving our institutions and people the skills to cope in a high-risk environment. As a highly digitalized society, we need to make sure that public services remain available and data is kept safe also during aggression and crisis. Last year, Estonia nearly doubled its annual cybersecurity budget. This had instant results. All countries and companies must significantly increase their investment in cybersecurity. When a few years ago, hospitals only had to worry about some drug addict coming and stealing their morphine, now their security risks are cyber. If they are cyber attacked, they could be taken down and there could be civilian casualties. We all talk about cooperation, but this is not enough. The cyber threat picture can change fast, so there is a need for swift information exchange. We need a high level of trust between like-minded countries, service providers, and intel agencies to share the kind of information that can prevent attacks elsewhere in the future. For example, in the European Union, the Estonian National Cybersecurity Center is by far the most active in sharing cyber threat information with cyber authorities in other member states. The bad guys share information with each other, so must friends. Second, we must step up our efforts in cyber capacity building. Closing the digital divide must go hand in hand with building up cyber resilience. Estonia has long shared its know-how. A recent example is helping to set up a new cyber competence center for Latin America and the Caribbean in the Dominican Republic. We have also been helping countries in Africa, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe build more robust cyber defenses over many years. Third, we must do more to send a clear signal that there's no place for impunity, not in cyberspace, not anywhere else. Becoming better and faster at attribution is one important thing. But we need to look also at the big picture. Russia's strategic goals are much bigger than Ukraine. It wants to rewrite the world in its own image, where might makes right. In the struggle between democracy and autocracy, the digital sphere is not the sideshow, but the front line. A few weeks ago, Russia tabled a new cyber warfare treaty at the UN. It aims to undermine the obligations for states under existing international law and justify censorship domestically. But existing international law applies in cyberspace in full. One of the risks I see is sleepwalking into negotiating new legally binding international rules with an outright war criminal. We can't negotiate new international norms where an aggressor feels like the existing ones are not suitable for its goals. Let's review and be aware of our engagement with Russia in international organizations. And finally, it is clear that security can no longer happen in silos. Any serious approach to defend liberal democracies will have to go beyond current institutional limitations. We must build connections and set standards with those we can trust, especially as new technologies like AI, 5G, quantum computing become realities. The Indo-Pacific region is at the forefront of this conversation. Those in the region who share the same values should be natural partners for European countries. We must keep widening the circle of like-minded countries. For too long, we have been over-reliant on countries who do not share our values and who weaponize our trust. The era of such dependencies has come to a close. We must be able to shape the age of rapid technological development so that it will serve our societies, including fostering ethical AI and building more trustworthy digital ecosystems. Ladies and gentlemen, liberal governments cannot do this alone. It needs to be in partnership with the businesses and civil society. And it also involves big tech putting its money where its mouth is. To protect democracy, transparency, better algorithms, adequate content moderation also in smaller markets. We are in it for the long haul. Tyrannies like Russia do not want freedom and democracy to prevail. It is a direct threat to dictatorship. That is why they will keep trying to turn technology into a tool of oppression and means to destabilize free societies. Our job is to help Ukraine win the war, rethink our connections, and ensure impunity does not prevail in any sphere, cyberspace included. Thank you.
Now I note that some powerful messaging there and some really an important focus on impunity. And as we think about that, let's acknowledge that Russia has just taken presidency of the United Nations Security Council. Vasyl, I want to come to you first after that. We're talking about leadership. We've talked about it a lot from your president. We've just heard from another terrific leader. What do you need to see from the rest of the world in terms of leadership, just to make sure that Russia is held to account for what it's doing to Ukraine right now?
Look, firstly, I would like to reflect on a great address from the Prime Minister of Estonia. And I think this has been extremely strong, very powerful, very direct and calling spade a spade. And I think that's important that this message is amplified by leaders of other free countries out there. And we see it happening. Often when we talk about the resilience of the Ukrainian people, we should be also talking about the resilience of the international coalition of nations. And there are now over 50 which are contributing military gear to Ukraine. And of course, it's important that that is sustainable, that that support is consistent and comprehensive. For us, it's a matter of survival, because last year it was all about defending the country, right? And of course, this year, we have a purpose, and the purpose is to win the war. And our fight is not about as long as it takes. We should ensure that it is as quickly as possible, right? So for us, it's difficult, it's tough. We need to have the right tools to repel the Russians from Ukraine. I was still in Ukraine when the war started, and I fled Kyiv with my family, 2 kids, my wife, and I then helped my family to get to the border with Romania. They crossed the border on foot, and my 5-year-old son asked my wife, "Why are we in Romania?" And my wife said, "While Romania is part of NATO, Russians will not invade Romania." And when we came to Australia months later, my son asked, "Is Australia part of NATO? Will Russians invade Australia?" And for us, Ukrainians, it's extremely difficult when your kids start talking about war. The matter is, and the challenge is how can we ensure that that war on democracy, which has been declared by Russia and supported by other countries, including China, how can we get that message out that democracy should prevail? And democracy is often vulnerable, and autocracies know how to abuse democracies because they know the weaknesses, they use those weaknesses. It's been already, once Australia was the biggest non-NATO contributor to Ukraine, now several other countries have overtaken Australia. And Australian support is essential. Bushmasters have become that Anzac Spear, that Aussie mateship that's been saving lives, but also has been extremely valuable and effective on the battlefield. We need more of that support seeing. Last time the major package for Ukraine was announced 6 months ago. So it's important that Australia continues sending that support to Ukraine. And I think that the focus of Australia on the Pacific is clearly understood. That's a geography. But I think for the Pacific, the strategy is clear. America should be here, Europeans should be here, British, French, and Germans have to be here to solve the issues of the Pacific. Therefore, it's so important for all these countries to see Australia more involved and engaged in Europe. Hence, more support for Ukraine. And I'm very thankful to have all these people here on the panel who've been out there, including Mick, who's traveled to Ukraine twice, who's been out there, the voice of in a way, explaining what's happening from a military standpoint of view.
Thank you. Baiba, you wanted to add?
I think quite clearly from what we heard from Palmer and all of you here, but also from Prime Minister Kallas, is that Ukraine is fighting the war of the future with regard its ability to innovate and adjust during the war itself. But it's also fighting the war of the past. I mean, what we are seeing in Bakhmut, what we are seeing in a number of other places, it's, everybody says it's the First World War. You know, line to line, digging in and battle to battle. So what it means is that both the war of the future and the war of the past has to be won today. I mean, so the bits and bots and mud and blood, it's right there. And what Palmer said about the way his company has adjusted, the way they have innovated, Can you tell us a bit more? What do you see? How we prepare for that war of the future in the same time as fighting the war of the past? Because this has been NATO's big task. We have really tried to incentivize the industry. We have tried to really move that sort of understanding of where we are, because for defense industries, it's also that war of the future that matters. It's not just, you know, the long-term contracts of the past that are out there.
Unfortunately, a lot of the things that can solve the problems that have been created are not things that can happen this year or next year or even in the next 5 years or even 10 years. The West has made so many mistakes that have compounded, that have put us in a terrible situation. I think there's a delusion that's certainly common in American culture, probably born of our media. And I don't mean the journalists, I mean our Hollywood media, our video games, our music, our myths, where, you know, fictionally the narrative is something's going terribly wrong, a lot of mistakes have been made, but then one person can come up with one great idea at the last second, a twist of the mind that solves everything. And people imagine that's how the real world works, but it's not. In the real world, you can sink yourself into problems that take you years or decades to pull yourself out of. One big mistake I think that the West has made is giving away a lot of its industrial capacity to adversaries like China. If you look at the tools that are being used in Ukraine, many of them were made in a time when America and other Western nations had the capacity to build large-scale industrial war machines. And many of these things were invented in a time when we were capable of building these things in large quantities. And this is also one of the reasons we're struggling to replace our inventory of these things. We gave up a lot of the ability to manufacture these things. In America, people don't grow up wanting to be manufacturing process engineers anymore because those jobs are all in China. People don't grow up wanting to be the types of engineers that lead to ability to manufacture systems at a scale that matters. And so it's very tempting to imagine, oh, the future is, you know, just all these future, you know, kind of small drones and all these things that honestly my company focuses on. But if you look at what's really the backbone of this war, it is industrial warfare. Massive quantities of artillery shells, massive quantities of mortar shells, massive quantities of armor and weapons that can only be manufactured by a country that is really well armed, well equipped in that way. And one of the other issues is that unfortunately we've moved to a type of procurement process, development process, and manufacturing process that by and large was designed for quasi-peacetime. It's designed to kind of build up an arsenal during a Cold War at immense cost, running defense somewhat as a jobs program or an economic program rather than what it should be, purely focused on building the most powerful possible capacity to fight the war that is coming in the future. And I say this as a very proud American. I'm a super jingo. I think America's the best country in the world, the whole package. And even so, I have to look at our strategy and recognize that it's been totally broken and totally wrong, and it's left us very ill-equipped. And of course, the US has burned through huge quantities of its stockpiles in what is really a relatively small conflict relative to what we could be drawn into in the future, not just for ourselves, but on behalf of our allies and partners. And you look at Europe, it's largely the same situation everywhere. People depleting arsenals that were built decades ago and having no real ability to spin up manufacturing because of the way we've built our procurement systems and cost-plus contracting, where you make money by doing work rather than necessarily spending your own money or being innovative about how you can get more for less money.
Now, I promise we did not plan this, but Mick, I was going to come next to you with a very similar question to that which Baiba just asked Palmer. And it's no coincidence. Is it not your Twitter handle, War in the Future?
It is.
Can you talk to us, so not only about war in the future, but you've been a military strategist for a very long time, and there are characteristics of war that are just not going away. So can you make that juxtaposition for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, every war is about continuity and change. I mean, if you have a look at every war, there's strata from everything that's gone before it. But there's always a few new things, whether it's geography, whether it's the emergent behaviour from the interaction of belligerents or some new technologies. And I think in this war, there's a couple that really stand out to me. The first one is this meshing of civilian, citizen, government and military collection, analysis and dissemination of information. I mean, I think that is one of the more profound outcomes of this war. It's meant that there's greater transparency, not full transparency, there never will be because you can't see into the minds of people, but there is greater transparency, and it resulted in that detection to destruction time to be greatly reduced, particularly along the front line. I mean, it's extraordinarily lethal to a degree we've not seen in generations. So I think that's quite transformative. I think obviously autonomous systems, aerial autonomous systems are the easiest ones because there's nothing to run into. Once you start getting to the land and maritime, it's going to be really hard. But we really have lagged in counter-autonomy systems, and there's a lot of catch-up to be done. And if you have a look at every military base in Australia, we would be hard-pressed to defend them, to be quite frank, I think. There's a range of other lessons. I think strategic endurance, which comes into not just the industrial capacity, but patience of publics. That's very important. But I guess one of the most important observations from this war for me is that war's still possible. I think we've seen narratives over the last couple of decades about the decline of violence, decline of war. They're wrong. They're just not true. They're counterintuitive, they're counter-historical. There's always someone who wants what others want. Humans are competitive animals.
If I could interrupt, I'd say it's also a seductive idea that comes up over and over again.
Absolutely.
The best-selling novel the best-selling book in 1903 in the United States, according to the New York Times, was a treatise on economics that included a chapter on why war in Europe was now impossible. Yeah, and it talked about how for thousands of years they've been fighting, but now because of their economic intertanglement, we will never again see war on the European continent. And then we had World War I and World War II in quick succession.
So Norman Angell's book is the one you're talking
about.
That's right. Every generation flirts with this lovely idea. And I think there's been a great degree of shock by many citizens around the world that this was even possible anymore. It is possible, particularly if you don't invest in preventing it, which is what we've done for 30 years. And the little brushfire wars that we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan did not prepare us well enough to tackle the authoritarians with their deep historical narratives who want to destroy the system that we've built over 70 years that benefits them. War's possible, and we need to talk about it. You don't avoid it by not talking about it, you avoid it by preparing for it. I guess the most important lesson, though, for me is war's human. It's not technological. And the most important part of that is good leadership and providing people with purpose. I look at that address that we just had, I watch President Zelensky's addresses and I go, man, we could do with some more of that. Yeah. And I look at President Zelensky and think, there must be a lot of politicians living today who look at the mirror every morning and think, would I pass the Zelensky test? And I think we all understand for a lot of them it's probably no. So, I think there's a lot of lessons that we've learned in the last 13 months. Some are new, many are old, but we need to learn them, we need to internalise them because there's two great scourges of this century. One is climate change and the other one is the challenges posed by authoritarian regimes. And we need to not be interested in them, but be committed to tackling both of them.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to put the audience on warning that I'd like to come to you for some questions. So in a couple of minutes, I will do that. So please, the lights are on, so I can see you. Please do stand at the mic, and we'd really like to hear from you. But before we do that, Prime Minister Kallas said something interesting, Palmer, that you have also said. She said we need to put our money where our mouth is. Tell me how you're doing that and why that's really important and how that really changes the way that defence industry is currently working.
Well, the way that I do, I mentioned this earlier, but we're a defence product company, not a defence contractor. And we see our role as partnering with governments, but we want to invest our own money in anything that we're building. If we don't believe in it enough to invest our own money, we shouldn't be building it. And we should certainly not get paid on a cost-plus contract basis where we get paid for our time and our materials and then a percentage of profit on top that incentivizes us to take as long as we can, to build the most expensive systems as we can, as slowly as we can, without getting canceled by the politicians in charge of funding the program. And that's been a really key part of our success, is our willingness to put our money where our mouth is. I think that it's important for companies that work in this space to live in fear of their own failure, to be looking over their shoulder and to realize that if they don't do a good job and if they don't move swiftly and with efficiency, that they are going to suffer financially And I think that that's good to understand, not just at the top leadership level, but I think even all the way down to the people who are building these things, who are working the lines. I think if you look at World War II, there was a different motivation there, where a lot of people in American factories felt an existential urgency, where if they didn't do a good job, that we were going to lose our way of life. And I think we had war propaganda that really took advantage of that. They said, they said Hitler thanks you every time you take a break. And I think lacking that kind of motivation, at the very least, I think not just the leadership of a country, not just the leadership of a company, but all the way down to the people working the line need to recognize that if they are not doing a good job and if they are not being efficient, that it could be their job on the line, their product on the line, their factory to be shut down. This is a sense of competitiveness that exists in almost every industry, but for some reason, not so much in the defense industry. And to be clear, I'm not saying that people who work in defense wake up and say, another chance to rest on my laurels and go on the taxpayer buffet. But you're naturally going to have a lower sense of urgency than if they deeply understand why efficiency is important and why scale is important.
Brilliant, thank you. Now I'm going to give, excellent. No, I'm just going to let Vasyl.
Oh, look, I just wanted to jump on this discussion on the military tech, because I think a lot of opportunities will be in Ukraine for venture capital firms who invest in military tech. As you know, if you look back into American history, where all tech companies come from, that was all from the cooperation with Pentagon and the defense industry. This is how it all started. And I think that connection was very strong. And now we see that cooperation in Ukraine. You see that innovation, new ideas, which we test in the battlefield. And I think you can scale it up globally. So if those of you who have appetite, come into Ukraine, invest in those startups, which are being pretty much now created as we speak here. And I'm sure you will make a fortune, apart from many other things, by just helping Ukraine.
Superb. That's it's exactly where I was hoping you might go, Vasyl. We do have a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Beck. Ian Martin from the Defence Base Command. Look, politics is the art of the possible. And for the first time in nearly a decade of conflict in Ukraine, we have the political opportunity and the political will to help Ukraine win and to rebuild Ukraine after the conflict. What else can we leverage from this opportunity? How can we change the strategic circumstances that led Russia to think that they could undertake this action and achieve their strategic outcomes? What can we change at either the political or indeed in the commercial space that will change Russia's strategic calculus in the future?
Ian, that's a brilliant question. I'm going to let you think about it for 2 seconds, because I can see Misha is waiting to come up and just ask one more question, and then I'll get you to take both of them, if that's okay.
Thanks. Misha from Australian Financial Review. Question is about assistance to Ukraine by Australia and the relevance to our own theatre in Indo-Pacific. So are these conflicts linked to Australia's immediate security needs? We've been speaking a lot about the Defence Strategic Review, about AUKUS. What do you say to people that say we shouldn't be sending aid to Ukraine, but we should be keeping things in reserve here to protect Australia and Australia's direct security interests?
So the first question, really, the core of it is deterrence, right?
Yeah.
How do we stop it? And then
Well, I think the first question goes to the Ukrainian theory of victory, really, which is about how do you win the war and win the peace, because you've got to have both. Because Russia is not going to give up on its imperial colonial designs in the short term. So what you have to do is first you've got to beat them, get them out of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, including Crimea. But then you need to rebuild Ukraine. Okay, so reconstruction of its society as soldiers come back in, refugees return, we deal with collaborators and achieve justice. And then set it up economically to succeed. And all those things have to take place whilst there's security guarantees, which might be NATO, might be bilateral things. It's not going to be as simple as let's just join NATO, I'm pretty sure, because that's just how the world works. I would like to think it would be. But I don't think we're going to change Russia's aspirations, at least until they're beaten, and at least until a whole lot of countries in Asia and Europe demonstrate that they won't put up with this kind of behaviour from Russia, from North Korea, from China, or any other country who thinks they can prey on small, medium-sized or even large democracies. On Misha's question, great question. Australia spends 7 cents per person per day on supporting Ukraine over the last 14 months. I reckon that's a pretty parsimonious amount. The reality is, what happens in Europe matters in Asia and vice versa, particularly now, more than ever, with this alignment of Putin and Xi. I think that might be an enduring relationship. It's transactional. They don't love each other. But I think it's an enduring relationship that we have to deal with. So we have to deal with Europe and Asia as a single problem now. And to suggest that Australia's security will be held just by having good relationship with our Pacific partners, I think is narrow-minded. And for the 12th largest economy in the world, we can do more than one thing. Previous generations of Australians, all the way back to Federation, understood what mattered in Europe mattered to us. I don't know how the current government's forgotten it, but quite frankly, our support to Ukraine has been parsimonious. And taking a selfie in Parliament doesn't kill a single Russian soldier, and that's what we need to be helping the Ukrainians do.
Look, it's very good. Thanks a lot, Mick. This is very good. I would like to answer the first question on what can we do, because I wish we had Australia as our neighbor. We can't do it. We can't change geography. We're going to have Russia there next door. If you look at a history, after the Second World War, Germany went through a period of time of re-education, rebuilt, but also a great deal was done within the country, within its society, to kind of look back and see the mistakes from the past. It's kind of difficult to deal with a nuclear power, and kind of difficult to expect that this is going to happen in Russia. But at the end of the day, if we look at the objectives which Russia had from the outset, they have not been able to achieve those objectives. More so, NATO is expanding to the east. Now Finland joined, Sweden is joining soon. They haven't achieved their military targets in Ukraine. They've actually lost 50% of the territory that they have occupied at the beginning. Most importantly, Russian president, who is now indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, has made the entire Russian society toxic. And this is a legacy he's leaving behind. Of course, we as Ukrainians understand that there will be a day when we will have to reconcile, but that will be probably a matter for my kids or maybe my grandkids who will have to do it. For my generation, it's already very difficult to reconcile that. What's important is that Ukraine has to be strong economically and strong militarily. Ukraine must be part of EU. It must join NATO. For us, we don't see any other alternative. Because how can you deter a nuclear power state next door from a future invasion or invasion in the future? I shouldn't be reminding you here in this forum, everybody knows history. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the second largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. By the way, I've seen on Twitter today the interview of Bill Clinton, where he talks about that period of time when he negotiated the deal with Ukraine and how he feels about it. Go and watch that interview. He talks about it. It's difficult to get this moral issue, and this is an issue he's now having because he was the president of the United States at that time, and they forced Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons, and Ukraine made the biggest contribution to the world peace ever. At the same time, Pakistan and India were developing their nuclear programs, while Ukraine gave up a big stockpile. Would Russians ever invade Ukraine? We still had nuclear weapons. Probably not. Now we need to make sure, and we need to make a contribution to the global non-proliferation, that actually the other nations should not be striving to have nuclear weapons to protect themselves, but rather invested money into social sphere, into hospitals, into education, into economic development, right? But now all of a sudden everybody's invested in defense industry because we understand we're not immune. And in a way, look, I mean, it's tough. It's tough. I don't know what's the future of Russia. And for them, having a democratic Ukraine next door was an existential threat for Putin. It was nothing about NATO. Because the only reason Putin did not want us in NATO, that he would not be able to invade us. And he always had a plan to invade Ukraine when he became president. And he became very clear about it, pretty much starting from 2007 when he spoke publicly about it. And he then delivered on what he was talking about. And I think the West, collective West, did not really deter him. And the West kept on building pipelines, supplying gas to Europe. And he figured that actually probably the West depends on Russia so much, they wouldn't mind if we invaded Ukraine. Nobody pretty much minded when they took over Crimea, invaded in Donetsk and Luhansk. Kind of everybody forgot about it. And now this war has been going on for 9 years. And this is what emboldened him, because he figured, well, everybody depends on me so much. They need my gas, they need my oil, they need my resources, they need my big market. You know, we're all buying all these luxury goods, and everybody loves it in Europe, right? Because it was the biggest market for many European luxury brands. And, but he underestimated. And I think he underestimated the willingness of Ukrainians to fight, our willingness to die defending democracy, human rights, and our choice to be who we want to be. And I think it's so unfortunate that now Ukraine has gained all that limelight for bad reason, for being invaded. But I'm glad that now people know Ukrainian history. They understand it's much better. You know, sadly, under this very, very unfortunate circumstances.
Baiba, please.
On the how to deter and how to change the strategic calculus, I think NATO is an important part of that element. So making sure that the adaptation we have gone through, both on the military, civil, defense, private sector, and other sides, is continuing and it's implemented. That includes the whole of deterrence, the nuclear deterrence, the integrated air missile deterrence, and conventional. So that is the wholesomeness of it all. So making sure that there is no mistake either by Russia or anybody else on the will and ability of the allies to deter, defend. Support Ukraine, not only support to win the war, but making sure that, and that is another stream of work that we are doing, that what Ukraine is and how it's adapting, how it's training, what equipment it uses, that it's compatible with NATO standards. So actually making sure that whenever there is a political consensus, whenever there is the conditions favorable to that, that there is a readiness for Ukraine to join if it still wants. And that is where I pick the fight with you, Vasyl, when you say NATO is expanding. NATO is not expanding. We have countries who want to join NATO. NATO does not go anywhere by itself. Yeah. If there are countries who want to join that are compatible with NATO standards, that contribute to Euro-Atlantic security, and they are ready, as Finland was, then at some moment there is a political consensus on that. So this is pretty straightforward.
Oops, I did it again. We've gone over time. Lucky you both think and talk fast. Palmer, you've got the last word.
I relinquish my time.
You relinquish your time? I think we're going to be a bit sad about that. You sure there's not one thought you want to leave us with?
Others have put it so much better than I could, and you should not suffer to listen to a weapons contractor on his opinions on how and why governments should support other nations. I think you've put it better than I could.
Well, look, thank you. Please join me in thanking this fabulous panel for a great conversation.